Russia is no longer waiting. After decades of carefully maneuvering between East and West, maintaining trade ties with Europe and the US, while gradually strengthening its role in BRICS, Moscow has now made a definitive pivot. That era of strategic balancing is over. Russia has made its choice, and it's not looking back. No more hedging, no more attempts to re-enter the Western-led global financial order. Instead, the Kremlin is going all in on BRICS. This isn't just a shift in foreign policy. It's a seismic change in how Russia positions itself in the world, and its implications go far beyond Moscow. What we are witnessing is a fundamental reordering of global power, one in which BRICS emerges not as a side project or a counterweight, but as the main stage of international economic cooperation and geopolitical strategy. For years, the West operated under the assumption that Russia could be economically contained, perhaps even broken through sanctions. That the threat of exclusion from Western markets, from the dollar system, from investment and trade, would be enough to keep Moscow in check. The logic seemed sound to many in Washington and Brussels. Isolate the economy, pressure the elites, and the system would bend, or break. But that didn't happen. In fact, something very different took place. The unrelenting pressure didn't collapse the Russian economy, it hardened it. It spurred innovation, forced new alliances, and above all, catalyzed a long-term strategic pivot that's now unfolding in real time. Putin's recent moves are a declaration of this new course. Russia no longer expects the West to change its posture. It no longer hopes for normalcy, for reconciliation, for a return to business as usual. Instead, it has accepted that the sanctions regime is not a temporary measure or a response to specific events. It is a permanent political weapon. The belief in Western capitals that they can dial sanctions up or down to shape Russia's behavior has, ironically, pushed Russia toward an entirely separate financial, commercial, and diplomatic sphere, one that does not rely on the dollar, on the euro, or on Western approval. This shift isn't theoretical. It's happening on the ground. Russia is building out parallel institutions, trade deals settled in national currencies, financial systems independent of SWIFT, energy markets reoriented toward Asia, and diplomatic frameworks that exclude the US and its allies. The role of BRICS in this transformation is central. Originally a loose coalition of emerging economies, BRICS is now becoming the foundation for an alternative global order, with China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and now expanding to include nations like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Argentina. The bloc is no longer marginal. It represents a massive share of global population, resources, and industrial capacity. And Russia sees in BRICS not just opportunity, but strategic necessity. Consider the pattern. Since at least 2014, when Crimea triggered the first major wave of Western sanctions, Russia has been under sustained economic pressure. But the history of sanctions goes back even further. In the 1970s, the US passed the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, restricting trade with the Soviet Union. That amendment wasn't repealed until 2013, more than 2 decades after the USSR collapsed. And even then, it was immediately replaced with the Magnitsky Act. The message is clear. Western sanctions aren't reactive policy tools. They are structural and deeply political, and removing them is not easy. Sanctions are baked into the legislative and institutional frameworks of Western governments. In the US, for example, sanctions can't simply be lifted by a president. They require congressional approval, which, in the current polarized political environment, is virtually impossible. So even if a US administration wanted to restore normal economic ties with Russia, its hands would be tied. This political reality is well understood in Moscow. This insight was underscored at a recent panel on Iran at the Valdai Club, one of Russia's premier foreign policy think tanks. An analyst noted that US sanctions are not like other policies. They are political landmines. Once enacted, they are almost impossible to reverse. They serve not just as deterrents but as permanent fixtures in the foreign policy landscape. Even in cases where progress is made diplomatically, the infrastructure of sanctions often remains intact. This is the trap Moscow is no longer willing to fall into. Recent developments reinforce this logic. In Saudi-hosted talks over Ukraine, Russia reportedly offered to readmit some of its banks into SWIFT in exchange for renewing the Black Sea grain deal. The US appeared open to the idea, but agreeing to something in principle does not mean it will materialize in practice. Because even if Washington backs a move, implementation requires coordination with Europe, and Europe, when it comes to Russia, has proven highly unpredictable. Emotions, ideological positioning, and internal political calculations often override strategic interest. This makes any Western commitment unreliable from Moscow's point of view. That's why Russia is done waiting. It no longer views the West as a credible or consistent partner. The future in Russia's view lies elsewhere. That future is in the East and global South, in energy corridors running through China and India, in defense partnerships with Iran, in currency swaps with Brazil, and in a BRICS Plus framework that offers trade and cooperation without the strings of Western political approval. It's building an ecosystem where it no longer depends on the IMF, on the World Bank, or on Western capital markets. It's investing in sovereign payment systems, local currencies, and economic zones that operate outside the dollar's reach. And this isn't just about avoiding sanctions. It's about something much deeper: economic sovereignty, the ability to set national policy free from foreign coercion, the power to engage in global commerce without being subject to Washington's veto. For Russia, BRICS is not a sideline, it's the main game. It's a place where Moscow can play a leading role, shape rules, and build partnerships that reflect its values and strategic interests. It's a bold move, yes, and not without risk. But from Putin's perspective, the alternative, remaining shackled to a hostile West, offers no future at all. Would you like a summary timeline or key milestones showing how Russia's integration into BRICS has evolved? Russia is now prioritizing its own industries, manufacturing, energy, defense, and technology, over globalist policies that once guided its economic direction. For decades, Moscow operated under a hybrid model, combining elements of state control with Western-style capitalism. But that model is now being replaced by a new strategy aimed at self-sufficiency. If foreign companies exit the Russian market, domestic businesses step in to fill the void. If Western investors pull their money, internal investment ramps up. This shift isn't a stopgap or a short-term adjustment. It's a fundamental, permanent restructuring of the Russian economy. There's historical precedent for such a transformation. In the late 19th century, under statesman Sergei Witte, Russia underwent rapid industrialization by focusing on internal development, building railways, expanding domestic production, and minimizing reliance on European imports. Today, Russia is again turning inward, but this time with the support of BRICS, a bloc that is gaining strength and credibility. Once dismissed as a loose association of developing countries, BRICS is now positioning itself as a formidable alternative to the Western-led global order. Economic data underscores this transformation. In 2024, the G7, which includes the United States, Canada, Japan, and Western Europe, recorded sluggish growth at just 1.9%, while the Eurozone barely reached 0.9%. In contrast, BRICS achieved 4.9% growth. This disparity is not coincidental. BRICS countries are accelerating their economic integration, and Russia is playing a leading role in this process. One of the most significant changes underway is in the realm of global payments. For decades, the US dollar has been the backbone of international trade, granting the United States substantial control over global finance. Russia is now challenging that system by working with its BRICS partners to build financial infrastructure that does not depend on the dollar or Western banking institutions. We're witnessing a growing trend of bilateral trade conducted in local currencies. For example, Russia and India are now trading in rupees instead of dollars. New payment systems are being designed to bypass Western-dominated networks like SWIFT. BRICS is also developing internal investment funds to support trade without routing money through Western financial centers. This is not just a shift for Russia. It represents a larger realignment in the global South, where nations are actively seeking alternatives to Western financial dominance. The consequences for Western companies have been significant. Following the ramp-up of sanctions in 2022, hundreds of Western firms exited the Russian market, expecting that their absence would cause the Russian economy to falter. That collapse never came. Russian enterprises quickly adapted and filled the gaps. When McDonald's withdrew, a Russian-owned alternative opened in its place. When Western banks closed operations, domestic financial institutions expanded their services. When European agricultural firms left, local Russian farms and Chinese partners increased production. President Putin made it clear that companies that abandoned Russia would not receive favorable treatment if they chose to return. Those that left would have to re-enter on Russia's terms. And many Russian companies, having adjusted to this new reality, have little interest in returning to the old system. They now operate in a changed global economy, one less reliant on Western frameworks and more focused on regional partnerships and national resilience. This broader transformation carries major implications for the rest of the world. For the West, it's a serious challenge. They are losing access to Russian energy, agricultural products, and critical raw materials. As BRICS continues to grow and strengthen its internal networks, the West's influence over global markets is steadily declining. For emerging economies, however, this shift represents a unique opportunity. Countries across Africa, Latin America, and Asia are observing the BRICS model closely, and many are actively seeking to join. With more than 20 countries now involved as full members or partners, BRICS is becoming a truly global force. The center of gravity in the world economy is moving, no longer fixed around Washington and Brussels, but increasingly aligned with Shanghai, New Delhi, Sao Paulo, and Moscow. And for Russia, this evolution is not only welcomed, it's being strategically driven. Russia is no longer waiting for the West to revise its stance or ease its policies. It has moved on, setting its sights on a new global order. The economic transformation underway is not slow or speculative, it's moving quickly. BRICS is leading this realignment, offering faster growth, more resilient trade networks, and newly built financial systems that challenge the old norms. Russia is not merely reacting, it is actively shaping this new reality. And this isn't just about one country's response to sanctions. It's part of a global trend toward a multipolar world. For decades, the West wrote the rules of global commerce and finance, enforcing them through institutions and currencies it controlled. That dominance is now fading. Far from weakening Russia, sanctions have triggered innovation, self-reliance, and stronger partnerships across the global South. The more nations follow Russia's example, the more diluted the West's economic control becomes. What comes next remains to be seen. Will BRICS continue to expand? Will the dollar lose its dominance in global trade? Can the West find a strategy to counter this accelerating shift? The global balance of power is changing rapidly, and it's essential to stay informed and engaged with these developments. The old world order is showing cracks, and the rise of new economic powers is already reshaping the future.